Owning a boat comes with a number of perks, like being able to say ahoy or land ho and not feel weird about it. So here's another perk. Geico's boat insurance offers access to the largest towing fleet on the water. And with specialist support from agents that are as passionate about boating as you are, there's so much value that you'll want to say, shiver me timbers, and not feel weird about that either. Get more with Geico.
This is Wheelbearings. I'm Dan Roth.
And I'm Sam Abu-Al-Samad, coming to you this week from Chicago.
Yeah, and so we're up to episode Lucky 13. We have a few things to talk about, certainly Chicago, and then some fuel economy, I guess, postulation. Yeah, we'll say postulation because I can't come up with a better word. More thoughts about what happens if we abolish the EPA and people who are really enthusiastic about that. Again, from Chicago, the sights and sounds, really, because it's Chicago, so there's not a whole lot going on at the show. It's got some stuff, but not a whole lot. And then little VW news, and backing off to first things first. You're in Chicago, Sam. What did you drive there?
Actually, I drove the train. No, I took the train. Took the train from Ann Arbor to Chicago, which is, especially this time of year, is actually probably the best way to get here. Certainly the most reliable way to get here. Oftentimes in early February, if you're driving from Michigan to Illinois. In West Michigan, you can get hit with some pretty severe snow squalls and whiteouts, so it can get pretty nasty. So I left the car that I've been driving for the last few days in the garage and took the train. And that car is the Volvo S90 T6 Inscription.
Yeah, and the train is probably something like Hyundai or Bombardier or something like that.
Actually, I think it's probably older than that. Who knows who made it? I mean, it's an Amtrak train, and it's not an Acela, so it's pretty old. But that said, it's still compared to flying, especially on short hops like this.
It's nice. There's so much room.
Yeah. I mean, it's barely an hour flight from Detroit to Chicago, and it's from Ann Arbor, it's just over a 4-hour train ride. But when you factor in, from my house to Metro Airport is about 20 minutes. Park the car. By the time you get to the terminal, go through security, go through all the nonsense of boarding, and then reverse the process at the other end and get from O'Hare into downtown Chicago, you're looking at a minimum of 4 hours anyway. And that's assuming your flights don't get delayed, again, by winter weather, which tends to hit Chicago this time of year. So, it's taking the train's a good relaxing way to do it. You got lots of room to spread out, and it's relatively inexpensive. They get power at all the seats. They got Wi-Fi. So yeah, it's the way to do it.
So while we are a car podcast, we clearly have some other interests in to public, not even public transport, but just other
forms of transport. Yeah.
Trains are super cool.
Yeah. I mean, it's no Shinkansen, but it'll do.
But it's definitely not as luxurious as the S90 T6, especially the Inscription. So what do you think of that car?
I like it a lot. The T6 is the top end of the conventional powertrain versions in the S90, at least for the North American market. So that means it's a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine with both a turbocharger and a supercharger. It's a strong engine. It's the same powertrain, and this is essentially the same platform architecture that's in the XC90. And I guess, this will also be getting, since it's Volvo's scalable platform architecture, it will be getting scaled down for the new 60 series, the new S60 sedans and V60s and XC60s. But the S90, is a very attractive looking car. Lovely interior, some really nice wood trim and lots of leather. And unlike the plug-in hybrid XC90 that I drove a couple of months ago, this one has a conventional transmission shifter, conventional Prindle that you shift back and forth. It's a mechanical linkage. So you always know exactly which gear you're selecting, whereas there was tended to be some uncertainty with the electronic switch system in the hybrid.
Yeah, when they start to mess with the shifters, I don't like it. And especially for Volvo too, because they've had such flawless, carefully studied ergonomics for so many years that it just flummoxes me that they would have they would make a change like that.
Yeah.
But,
aside from that, a lot of the rest of it, having the car style ride height. Aside from that, though, a lot of the rest of the experience is very much like the XC90. You have the same Sensus infotainment system, which is an 11-inch portrait format touchscreen setup.
And it's kind of terrible.
Yeah, it's not the best system on the market. You've got three screens that you can swipe back and forth between. A lot of the controls are buried in the UI, and it's not always entirely clear, where the things that you want are. In the middle of the central of the three screens, if you have an Android or Apple smartphone and plug it in, you'll get CarPlay or Android Auto displays showing up in the lower half of the screen. So that part works well enough. But yeah, it's definitely a system that needs some rethink as far as the overall user interface and user experience. It's also not the most responsive system.
Yeah, and so I started off with my first experience with that system going, well, it's kind of neat. I do like that it's actually a large enough screen that they can give some of the controls some real estate around them. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit easier to hit your target. But the more and more I use it, the less and less I like it. So I'm less willing to give them a pass on that, especially for a brand that's all about safety. And when you get an interface that's so distracting, it really sort of goes completely counter to what they're preaching. The other question I had is, so my experience with the scalable product architecture is that it certainly looks beautiful inside and out. It's well executed, well assembled, but it's kind of let down by its ride and handling balance. I found it to be nowhere near as supple as I had expected it to be, even with the air suspension. And I don't know if that's because it's lacking chassis rigidity or Volvo's just not as good at tuning suspensions as Audi and BMW.
I think it's probably more of the latter. I think they just need a little bit more time and care with the chassis dynamics, the tuning of the chassis dynamics, because I think it's basically a pretty solid architecture. It certainly doesn't feel like it has any flex, and I think it's just a matter of tuning, the spring rates and the damping. And maybe making some adjustments some slight adjustments in the geometry to get the right feel in there. You're right. It's not as supple as you might expect from a Volvo. But on the other hand, it's certainly no worse, in terms of its ride quality than most of its competitors in the current premium segment. In fact, it's probably a little more supple than recent Jaguars that I've driven. So and those were a brand that was always known for providing at least in the old days, providing a mix of supple ride and good handling. Certainly in the last decade or so, they have gone more towards the German route of a more solid ride feel. And I think, Volvo has kind of gone in that same direction, trying to emulate what the German brands do. Perhaps, maybe with not quite as much finesse as the Germans.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where when they've got it, because it has that snubbed ride quality that's very, very well controlled, but it's not harsh. And in the last couple of XC90s I've driven, it's been harsh and not as snubbed as I want it to be. And, some of it's the fact that it's an SUV on that architecture with giant wheels and, just there's a lot of mass moving around, even, no matter how much aluminum they put in the arms and stuff. So I'm very curious to drive the sedan. I've only actually like walked by one at this point and looked at it for a little while, and it's a beautiful car, and it must be great on the highway.
Yeah, and what's particularly impressive, I think what's actually even better than the S90 to my eyes is the V90, which they showed. They showed it at the Detroit show last month. I think they actually first showed it perhaps at the LA Auto Show. I think it was in LA. But it's basically imagine you just stretch that roof line back into a classic Volvo station wagon style. And it's a big luxurious station wagon, and I think that would be the one I would choose probably out of all three of the current 90 series models. I would certainly take the V90 over the XC.
Yeah, well, and that's where Volvo's mojo is. It's funny, they kind of ran away from wagons for a while. They went pretty hard at the SUVs, and
they're following the market. Yeah,
I know, but I think that they've discovered too that with the new SPA cars and really with Geely ownership, since sort of this new generation of vehicles from Volvo, they're kind of finding their feet again and saying, you know what, we have something that not everybody else has. Yeah, we're a little nichey, but we're unique enough that we can lead with style and we can burnish our reputation, our brand, and that's going to carry a lot of cachet for our product. And so I can see that shift, and they're trading on a reputation of safety and that perception of being a little different. It's and they don't have to compete with Saab anymore either, directly head on. So they are like the one Swedish car. So you still get that European flavor. You get that Scandinavian style, which is certainly something that you can sink your teeth into as a designer. And so they really do. They stand out a lot more than they had in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, and Volvo never really had the quirkiness of Saab. It didn't have weird little things like the key in the center console or other oddball configurations.
No, they only broke they broke as often, but that's about it.
I'll let as the owner of several or former owner of several Volvos, I'll let you attest to that.
Yeah, the old ones were great. The newer ones, I remain enthusiastic, but they're a new car, and new cars are different now. They're a lot more. They're not for tinkerers, shall we say?
Yeah.
And that's every new car. That's not just Volvo. So they're not unique in that.
So what about you? What have you got this week?
I just stepped out of a Nissan Titan Platinum Reserve.
Which one did you have? The XD, the diesel?
No, I didn't have the XD. So this is just the straight up Titan, the half ton.
Okay.
And it's been pretty well received. It's Truck Trends Pickup of the Year. It was a North American Truck of the Year finalist, and I can see why. At least in Platinum Reserve trim, which, by the way, sounds like cheap whiskey. It's really nicely decked out because this is the top of the line Titan. It's comfortable, it's quiet.
It's got all the goodies in there.
Yeah, and it looks good. It certainly looks like they borrowed a lot from the F-150, but I mean, if you're going to borrow, you might as well borrow from one of the best sellers. Mm-hmm. So I can't really fault them for that. There's only so much you can do with a pickup truck. Yeah, that's for sure.
You're either going to, end up with something that looks, more or less like an F-150, or, at the opposite end, like a Ram.
Yeah, and so I think they pull it off. It looks unique. It's not as ugly as the Tundra. And this is the one that Nissan plans to sell the most of. And it does pretty well in the heart of Truckville in that respect. It feels well planted and strong. Like the frame has a pretty rigid disposition. It's not trembling and flexing a lot. It actually feels a little bit more, like it has a stiffer backbone than even, I'm just, as we go here, I'll just use the F-150 as my benchmark. I liked its rigidity, just the solid feel, better than the last F-Series I was in. I love the Endurance V8. It's an evolution of the VK56. It probably still is just the VK56 in Nissan terminology. So that's a 5.6 liter V8. It makes 390 horsepower, I think 394 pound-feet of torque. It sounds so good.
It is a nice engine.
I dream of like a Nissan Z or an Infiniti G37 Coupe with this engine. I mean, that would just be perfect. It's good in the truck. I mean, it's certainly powerful. It's definitely not fuel efficient. It's like I got about 15.2 miles per gallon with it. Let's say I was doing about 70% highway with it. So as a commuter truck, it's got great power. It doesn't really have any issue other than you have to expect that the fuel economy is going to be kind of low. And that's not terrible fuel economy. It's rated like 15-21. If you can edge it towards 21 with this powertrain, you're doing okay. The 7-speed auto is pretty well programmed. I like that it actively downshifts. Like when you come down a ramp and stuff, you can hear it and feel it drop down a gear. So it's always kind of at the ready. Like somebody who actually knew how vehicles should drive actually programmed all this stuff. So I like the Titan a lot. I don't know if you've had a chance to be in it or around it that much.
Yeah, I had the Titan XD diesel, also in Platinum Reserve, back last September or so, and then last summer, early August, I was out in California for a Nissan truck drive event, and they had the updated Pathfinder, the Armada SUV, and also a couple of different Titan variants, and I think that was the first time they had the half-ton V8 to drive. So I get to drive basically the same one that you did, and yeah, I was really impressed with the driving dynamics, the ride quality of that truck. It was very much, it was as good as any of the three domestic brands, which all have gotten really good in the last 5 or 10 years, compared to where they were even as recently as the early 2000s. They have really good ride quality. They don't bounce around on even rough roads anymore. They stay controlled. When you're driving them around without a load in the bed, it used to be that you hit the slightest bump, if you weren't going directly in a straight line, and, they would go skittering sideways, and they don't do that anymore. And the Titan does just as good a job, I think, with that as the domestics, which really makes the Tundra stand out by comparison, by how not good it is.
Oh yeah, the Tundra is a dynamic mess, and I like the Tundra is certainly not a bad truck choice in that. And like, if you need a truck and you go buy a Tundra to do truck work, there's no shame in that. It will do it.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's you got 5 full-size truck brands to choose from. And I think 4 of them are, so far ahead of where the Tundra is that, I wouldn't even consider a Tundra at this point.
I mean, I don't think you're going to get a great deal on a Tundra. And I also don't think you're going to get a great deal on a Titan. I mean, the Tundra for sure, because it's a Toyota truck and they just hold onto their value for some silly reason. But yeah, I mean,
a Tundra is certainly going to be reliable, being a Toyota, but in so many other respects, it's just not up to par anymore, especially now that the Titan has largely caught up to the domestic competitors.
Yeah, I mean, I was really impressed with how well behaved the Titan is. So part of my critique here, I mean, I feel like it's a bit disingenuous to send the Platinum Reserve out into the fleet, because we're not really getting a true picture of how most of them are going to be equipped. It's easy to be taken in by how nice this truck is. It's luxurious.
Well, actually, you'd be surprised. I suspect. I'll have to check. I'm going to be at a roundtable session with Fred Diaz, who's head of Nissan trucks tomorrow.
Stole from Ram.
Yeah.
He's done great work. I really do. This is a very competitive truck.
Yeah. And, I'll check with him, see if he's willing to share any information on what percentage, of the high end trims. But certainly, if you look at the Ford, GM and Ram, they sell an extraordinarily high percentage of these premium trim levels. Like last year here at the Chicago show, Mark Lenev, the head of marketing for Ford, did a keynote at the breakfast here. And, he talked about the fact that, fully 1/3 of F-Series trucks are the premium trim levels, the Platinum, the Limited, the Lariat, and the Raptor. And those high end trim levels also have really high margins. I mean, when you look at the numbers, and we'll get to this in a bit when we get into our fuel economy topic. But when you look at the profit numbers, for the domestic brands, the bulk of that profit, the cash cows, are these high end trucks, because they sell a lot of those trucks, and every one of those has huge margins on them. You're talking anywhere on some of these premium trucks, you're talking probably as much as $20,000 a truck in pure profit.
Because at the end of the day, the basic truck costs what the basic truck costs, and everything else is kind of like an incremental. As nice as it is, the $2,000 package with the Sony audio system doesn't cost Ford anywhere near that to put in there.
Exactly.
So the profit, I can see that. I just feel like it's, we get a sense of what the premium trim is like, and but it's really.
But even in the lower end trims, the base trims, the Titan is still surprisingly good. I did have a chance last summer to drive, some of the non-Platinum Reserve trim levels, and it was still a really solid truck. And they're just at the point now, and they started rolling out, the original XD with the diesel engine was the first one to hit the market in late 2015. And, right about now, they're basically finishing up the lineup, the new Titan lineup, in the coming weeks or so, or maybe in another month or two. They'll be, putting on sale even a single cab work truck version, for the type that appeals to contractors and utilities and so on. That they end up putting racks or boxes on the back with all the tools and equipment. So these are the commercial fleet trucks.
Yeah.
So they're hitting every segment of the full size truck market.
And and it's definitely a full size truck. That low end one that's like the Titan S or whatever. That's probably going to have a version of the VQ V6. Everything I found has said V6 to be announced soon. But the things I like about it are that it did feel much nicer than the F-Series trucks I've been in. Even the Lariat trim, I look around an F-Series and it feels like loose fit and just not quite as well screwed together as the Titan. I felt like it was really well assembled. It's huge as a crew cab. It feels like it's 3/4 of an Armada. Mm-hmm. And it actually felt very familiar to like the QX80. And I think that's probably because there's a lot of similarity there, or a lot of lessons they learned. I'm not sure if this is based on the patrol frame.
No, it's not. It's they've actually got two unique platforms for the Titans, the current generation Titans. So the XDs, which are
that's its own, right?
It's actually based on the NV 3500 platform.
Okay.
So it shares its frame, I think, with the NV 3500 vans, so the heavy duty vans, and then the half ton is a lighter duty variant of that. So it's actually a unique parts, and there's quite a few. A lot of the platform is actually different, even though the trucks look the same. So the upper body is the same. Underneath, they're actually quite different.
This is the magic you can do with body on frame vehicles. As long as the body mounts are there, you can put them, and
just drill the bolt holes in the right spot and you're good to go. Yeah.
I mean, Nissan, for whatever it's worth, they know how to make a truck that's pleasing. I don't know what they're like to own. I know that the Titan's been around a while now, and the first one's had some teething pains, but overall, they're a solid player. I'm impressed with this truck. It doesn't feel like the best value compared to some of the domestics. It's the Titan S is going to start at like 29.5, and then that's about 2,500 more than a comparable F series. The price ratchets up there quick. This was about a $55,000 truck. I didn't have a Monroney in it, but like that is like when we talked about the F-Series trim levels, like that's King Ranch or Platinum territory. So that's a lot of dough for a half ton that probably payload wise is a little bit behind. The payload.
Yeah, that is the one area where they're lagging a little bit is in payload towing.
And towing too. I think part of it though is like it's like 1,000 pounds heavier than some of its competitors, depending on sort of how it's equipped again. But like a Titan S compared with like a Ram Tradesman, that it's close to 800 or 900 pounds heavier.
Yeah.
So that really does affect your towing and your payload.
It certainly does.
But maybe, the weight is maybe what feels good about it. It's and the only other real criticism I had was like it's got that Nissan infotainment system that just feels old and it washes out in the sunlight and just, I feel that that's probably an easy upgrade for them to make as they go.
Yeah, that's something I'm sure, we'll see a running change in the next year or two. Hopefully that's something that Nissan will address, across their lineup over the next year or two.
I'm sure Nissan hopes it's something Nissan will address. But enough about us. We had some topics. We can dive in. We can talk about fuel economy impact of the regulatory executive order, which basically wants to roll back. You wrote a piece for Navigant about this, where they kind of want to roll back some of the federal regulations on corporate average fuel economy.
Well, yeah. So what I did, this is for our blog, the company that I work for, Navigant Research. My day job is I'm an analyst there, and I cover the auto industry. I look at advanced transportation technologies and powertrains and connected vehicles and those sorts of things. And so we have a blog that all our analyst team all contributes to. And I wrote a post last week about that came right after the president signed the executive order on regulations. And this executive order basically stated that no federal agencies can impose any new regulations unless they eliminate two existing regulations.
Which sounds a whole lot easier than it's going to actually be. Yeah.
Well, I mean, effectively, what that's going to mean is that, you're just not going to see any new regulations for a while. So part of that is that, the vehicle to vehicle communications mandate is probably going to be dead in the water. But that's a separate one. This one that I wrote was looking at fuel economy from the perspective of fuel economy. Now, part of that executive order was anything that's legally mandated by Congress is exempted from that. Because the way executive orders work, basically the president can interpret. Or has some leeway in interpreting the laws or interpreting how the laws are imposed. But, if there's something specific in the legislation that's passed by Congress, you can't overrule that. So the fuel economy regulations, the corporate average fuel economy regulations actually came out of the 2007 Energy Independence Act, which was passed under George W. Bush's administration, signed into law by President Bush, and that law, was the one that said, by 2020, car makers need to get to 35 miles per gallon fuel economy. So or get to at least 35 miles per gallon. So from that, NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which oversees the corporate average fuel economy enforcement, and EPA, which oversees emissions, basically use that as the starting point. And so the 54.5 mile per gallon target that they ultimately imposed for 2025 was built off of that. They used the 35 miles per gallon as the starting point, did the various cost benefit analysis that they're required to do, and the technical analysis, and then came up with the 54.5 mile per gallon standard in 2025. So essentially, with the executive order, the only thing, unless Congress actually repeals that part of the law, they can what EPA and or NHTSA can do is they can roll back something, the standard from that 54.5 mile per gallon down to 35, and the other thing that they could do is change the enforcement, change the penalties for missing the targets.
Well, they were, regardless of who's president at this point, that's really aggressive, going from 35 to almost 55 in 5 years. Am I reading that correctly? They were going to have to go from corporate average economy of 35.
They would actually be going, because the starting point for all of this, from 2011 was like 24 miles per gallon.
Right.
And so basically they were going up at a pace of about 4% a year. So that's.
But then, that's how they got from, because, right, if they have to hit 35 miles per gallon corporate average fuel economy in 2020, and then just 5 years after that, that's not even a full generation of vehicles.
Right. Well,
to be at 54 and a half.
Yeah. Well, what the law said was they had the law said that they had to set the standards so they got to at least 35. The actual standard that ended up being imposed put them at around 40, I think around 41 or 42 in 2020. So it goes above and beyond the law. So that's what I'm getting at. Is
I see.
NHTSA and EPA went the law specified a minimum, which was 35. But it didn't give a maximum.
That's the target.
Right.
I see.
And so based on the evaluations, they determined that 54.5 in 2025 was feasible, both technically and economically feasible to reach. So that's where that came from. So what could happen now, conceivably, and I think there's a pretty good likelihood that it will happen, is that that NHTSA and EPA will roll back the targets back to basically set it at the minimum that was mandated by Congress, which is 35 miles per gallon. And then the other thing that they can do, as part of the regulations, if a manufacturer fails to meet their targets for every mile per gallon that they miss the target by, they get a certain fine per vehicle that they sell, for their fleet. So the more vehicles they sell and they miss the target, they can get fined millions or tens of millions of dollars each year for missing those targets. So they could also roll back those those fines, so that even though they may miss, even if they miss the reduced thresholds, or even if they don't change the targets, if they leave the targets at 54.5 and just eliminate the penalties, effectively it's like it not being there at all if there's no penalty.
Yeah. Well, the penalty has its own chilling effect, but the lack of a penalty doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to continue to see more efficient vehicles.
Right.
This is something that has to play out.
Right. And in fact, what I get at in the blog post that I wrote is that regardless of what EPA and NHTSA do with the regulations, the reality is that over the next product cycle or two, it's probably not going to have any real impact on their product planning and technology planning, because they still have to meet standards for California and the other states that follow California, but which would still be at that higher level. Plus, they still have to meet the zero emissions vehicle mandates that California has imposed. So they still have to sell a lot of electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. And there's also the fact that the auto industry is a global industry, and these companies have to sell vehicles in Europe and in Asia and other parts of the world that are not planning to roll back their standards. They are planning to maintain their standards, which are even tougher than those here in the U.S. So it's not going to change the technologies that they develop and the products that they develop. But what it could do, and this kind of in a way ties in with one of the other stories we have on the rundown tonight, it could change their marketing strategy for what vehicles and what equipment they market in different parts of the U.S. So if EPA, if the feds roll back the standards or roll back the penalties for missing the fuel economy targets, while California and the other 9 states that follow the California rules maintain theirs, what we're likely to see is a shift in which products get marketed to different regions of the country. So, they're going to push, the electrified vehicles in California and the Northeast. And then in the other parts of the country, they will, sell the vehicles, more of the vehicles that consumers in most of the country actually seem to want to buy, which are bigger, less efficient sport utility vehicles and trucks. And that kind of gets us into one of the big new products that's being shown this week in Chicago. And when I say big, I mean big literally, is the 2018 Ford Expedition, which is getting its first full redesign in a decade. And so this is Ford's full-size pickup or full-size SUV competitor to the Chevy Tahoe and Suburban and the GMC Yukon and Yukon XL.
Well, and it's more than a decade too, right? Like it was pretty heavily revised, but this same basic vehicle has been around since the 2002.
Well, the current version of the platform debuted in 2007 when it got the independent rear suspension.
I thought they had that from. It was the Explorer that came out in the early 2000s.
Yeah, the Explorer came out. Explorer around 2000 got an independent rear suspension, but the Expedition didn't get it till 2007. And so that's the key difference. I mean, it used to be that the Expedition was based on the F-Series platform, the F-150 platform. But in 2007, it diverged quite a bit and went from a solid rear axle to independent rear suspension, which even though the Expedition has never even come close to the sales of GM's full-size SUVs. In fact, last year, it was less than Ford sold less than a quarter of the number of Expeditions that GM sold of Suburbans, Tahoes, and Yukons. But the Expedition does have one huge advantage over the GM trucks, and that is that IRS. Because what that allows them to do, because with a solid rear axle, you have to shape the floor pan to allow the entire axle to move up and down, because the differential's got to move vertically, as you go over bumps and stuff. So what that means is, if you've ever tried to get into the third row of a Tahoe or a Suburban, you notice that the floor curves up quite a bit right behind the second row, and sitting in the third row, you end up sitting with your knees kind of around your ears, and it's not a very comfortable place to be. Whereas,
and there's 300 or 400 pounds of axle floating around there below you.
Whereas with the Fords, the floor pan can stay flat all the way back, which means that the seat is actually up off the floor, and you have a much more comfortable seating position in the third row of the Expedition.
I've always thought that the Expedition and the Navigator, at least the last few times I've driven them, actually, they drive really well. They drive in a way that's pleasing, especially with the EcoBoost V6. Somewhat more pleasing than the GM counterparts.
Oh yeah, and the independent suspension also has the added benefit of giving giving you better ride quality, better handling dynamics than the solid axle. But the primary reason why they do it is for that extra room in the back, because you don't have to accommodate the whole axle moving up and down. Only the wheels move up and down.
Yeah, when there was that whole rollover thing that Ford was dealing with back.
Well, yeah, there was that too. Yeah.
So that,
that was an issue with the Explorers, not with the Expedition. So
right. But I think that was sort of their secret, or not their secret, but their special sauce too. Like they looked at it and they said, well, we have the Explorer that's a pretty similar thing. Like let's propagate that. And they're not the exact same hardware across the lineup, but it was sort of,
yeah. I mean, the rear suspension architecture between the Expedition and the previous generation Explorer, the 2000 to 2010 Explorer, was actually, it's just basically the same layout. It's just scaled up for the bigger truck.
Yeah, and it's probably got an 8.8 in there, which is like completely bulletproof. And,
yeah.
But
what's really different, about this new Expedition, and presumably the Lincoln Navigator that we'll see in the not too distant future, is the body. For the last 7 or 8 years, the Expedition and the Navigator have been built at Ford's Louisville, Kentucky assembly plant, which also happens to build the Super Duty pickups. And if you'll recall, the Super Duty pickups just got a full redesign and went on sale in the last couple of months with an aluminum body, just like the F-150. Since they had to retool the Louisville plant to produce aluminum-bodied Super Duties, it makes sense that the other vehicles you produce in that plant are also going to go aluminum, and such is the case with the Expedition.
Yeah, well, that makes it save a little weight, although it's not as light as I thought it was going to be with the Switch. They've done some things already to the Expedition to take weight out of it, too. The biggest thing is, like, styling-wise, it looks a lot different, and it looks really good if somewhat like an enormous Explorer. But, it's the long wheelbase version is you can expect to lose about 300 pounds out of the biggest one, right? And it's the smaller ones are going to have less weight savings.
It'll be pretty close. Will it? I mean, depending on the equipment configuration, it'll be somewhere between 200 and 300 pounds on any given variant. I think the weight drop on the standard wheelbase one will probably be closer to 200 pounds. But again, it depends on the equipment you have. And, if you're comparing that, when they launched the aluminum F-150 a few years ago, they talked about weight savings of up to 700 pounds. But where they got that weight saving, that number from was by comparing the 3.5 liter EcoBoost aluminum F-150 against the previous generation steel F-150 with the 6.2 liter V8. So you were getting about 400 pounds lost through, going from steel to aluminum, and then another 100 or so pounds from the frame through a redesigned frame that went to more high strength steel, and then the powertrain changes also saved a couple of 100 pounds on the Expedition, because the Expedition got a mid-cycle refresh a couple of years ago that swapped the V8 for the 3.5 EcoBoost, and now is carrying over with an EcoBoost. You're not getting there's no gain there in terms of weight savings. So you're just looking at the transition from steel to aluminum, and especially on the standard wheelbase version, it's actually about 3 inches longer than the previous Expedition and about an inch wider. So you're getting some extra size, aluminum body, and there's a lot more equipment. There's a lot of new equipment that wasn't available on previous generation Expeditions. So you're trading off. You're losing weight with the steel to aluminum, but you're adding some back with other equipment. So the net is, depending on the configuration, is going to be between 200 and 300 pounds.
Yeah, and there's a reason why people love these things too. Looking at it, It's got 3 rows. They've made some changes to the second row seats. So like functionally it's better. You can get in with even child seats in there. I'm sure, again, it's going to be good to drive. It's going to be quiet. It's going to ride smooth. It's going to be, and now that they've upgraded the whole thing, you can get some of those newer technologies like the latest versions of sync and stuff that the older vehicle may not have had the electrical and data architecture to support. There's a lot of real change here that makes this a good vehicle to look at for, staying competitive in a field that, while you don't necessarily think of it all the time, the giant SUVs like these vehicles have been called dinosaurs now for the last 5 or almost 10 years, especially when we had a economic crisis and everybody was complaining about high fuel prices. And these things just have like that slow and steady audience of people who like them and who use them, and it's just a solid update of this kind of vehicle, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, GM sells a lot more of these things and has for many years than Ford does. I think GM sold about almost 260,000 Yukons, Suburbans, and Tahoes in 2016. Ford sold just shy of 60,000 of the Expedition and Expedition XL. And the thing I learned just the other day is that actually nearly half of the Fords were actually sold into rental fleets.
Well, see, I was going to ask that about GM. Like, do you think that that's fleet, and maybe it's not necessarily rental, but like government and municipal?
Yeah, the GM rental fleet number is about 15% of sales.
Really? People just like the GMs that much more?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, for whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure why. They've certainly got a reputation. People have been buying those things for far longer than Ford has offered a direct competitor with the Expedition. So it's hard to say, but certainly you do see a lot of, you mentioned government fleets. You see a lot of them being used for various government applications, to move VIPs around, and oftentimes they're converted, for bulletproof service, that sort of thing. And both companies actually also sell a lot of these SUVs overseas as well. They're quite popular, in the Middle East and
of course
other parts of the world.
The more ostentatious, the better.
Well, not necessarily, and that's the thing, that people buy them because they are tough. I mean, they'll take a lot of abuse, and they work very well in harsh environments.
That's true. And they have fantastic, air conditioning systems and stuff. That's one thing that the domestics do really well, is just sort of all those comfort systems work pretty nicely in these trucks. Yeah.
So, getting back to what I was mentioning earlier, this does kind of tie in with the whole fuel economy thing. So what we could potentially be seeing, particularly if what they do, if the way they handle this, at least in the short term, is just rolling back the penalties and leaving the targets where they are, but rolling back the penalties, what we could see is manufacturers, selling more of these types of vehicles into markets, in regions like Texas, where, Texas is already by far the biggest market for vehicles like this anyway. But selling more of these in the middle states and in the South, where these vehicles are also highly profitable. They get a lot of margin on these vehicles, and if they can boost the sales of these vehicles, even though it hurts their overall fuel economy average, if they're not getting penalized as much for it. Then what that will allow them to do is also push the EVs more in places like California and the Northeast, where they're required to sell those vehicles, and help offset some of the losses or reduced margins on those vehicles in those regions. So what this could end up doing is helping the bottom line for the automakers that are selling these types of vehicles. So it's all part of this big mix of changing not changing the the product plan, but changing the marketing strategy.
I mean, that's a little bit of interesting conjecture, especially since it's stuff that they're already working on. They've already got these things. I mean, I guess my concern, going back to the fuel economy stuff, is there seems to be, and we'll actually we'll cover this point a little bit in just a minute on one of our next topics, but there seems to be this great enthusiasm for pushing a lot of authority and decision making down to the state level. What that means for stuff like fuel economy is that you could get a mishmash of different state standards, almost like we do with gasoline, which makes it really difficult because, states have their own gasoline formulation standards, and that's one of the things that affects the price and the availability of fuel. It's not a nationwide thing. So you've got this patchwork quilt. If you wind up with that with fuel economy and emission standards, automakers they're going to race to not race to the bottom, but they're going to pick the one state that's the most restrictive and set that as the default. And then we're all going to, so we'll all be California at that point. Because the variations cost too much money. Even like, you were pointing out with a global market, at a certain point, they're just going to make one that they can sell as many places as possible without having to make any changes.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly one possible way it could play out. I think only we're just going to have to wait and see, for specifics. But I do suspect that it's probably going to be more like a dual strategy.
I like your strategy better. It sounds better.
Yeah, certainly, I understand, where you're coming from with, wanting to have a single lineup. But I think realistically, based on what's probably going to happen, you're probably looking at two. The thing is that they're going to have these two types of vehicles anyway.
That's true. I mean, they're already so far.
I think it's just a matter of now they're going to have the option of selling more volumes of the lower fuel economy vehicles, the lower fuel economy, higher margin vehicles, to help offset the other ones that they still have to sell, at least for now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've removed, we're talking about removing one of the sticks, and that sort of makes a different carrot show up. But it's good for an automaker. I just, again, taking the long view too, it's kind of like, at what cost?
I mean, I'm not implying that this is, necessarily good for the country as a whole. But purely from a business perspective of what would be the rational thing to do, if you're trying to run the business and trying to maximize your profits, while still meeting, the various regulatory mandates you have in different regions, whether that be different regions of the country or different regions of the world. This from a purely business standpoint, this seems like the most rational solution, regardless of whether it's actually the best solution for, the environment or the country as a whole. Yeah,
well, let's segue and we can talk about how there's we picked up a piece about NBC News did it, but the 4 Republican lawmakers who want to abolish the EPA. It sounds like there's a whole lot of folks that really want to push stuff down to the states and move those regulations out of the federal level. I can understand that to a certain degree, the argument that states are better at making decisions for those states than the federal government is. But yeah,
well, that's at least in theory that might seem to be the case.
Right. That's the theory. I don't think that's we are where we are with the federal stuff because the state level stuff, we didn't see it play out as well and as efficiently as it needed to. But I don't know what's your piece to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, even under current regulations, in areas where, the states are responsible for certain things, they have not, a lot of states have not done a good job of protecting the environment and protecting, the air and water that their citizens have to breathe and drink. Look, for example, at, the state I live in Michigan. We all heard about what happened in Flint.
In Flint, right?
Where the state, imposed an emergency financial manager on the city of Flint. Yes, Flint absolutely had a lot of problems long before the state essentially came in and took over, and they have for decades for a wide variety of reasons. But one of the first things that the emergency financial manager in Flint did was he looked at how much the city was spending on water. They were getting, Flint, like many cities in Southeast Michigan, was getting its drinking water supply from the Detroit water system.
So also the cost of water from the Detroit water system is screwy. It's really high.
It is high, but it's also very high quality water. Where I live in Ypsilanti, just outside of Ann Arbor, we also get our water from the Detroit water system. And, yes, it's on the high side, but, I don't think it's extraordinarily high, at least, as a homeowner. And, the water quality is very good. What they did in Flint was they basically said, okay, we're not going to buy water from Detroit anymore. We're going to take it from the Flint River. And let's just say the Flint River is not the cleanest source of water in the world. And so that resulted in them putting a lot of extra chemicals into the water, which were quite corrosive. And because of, a lot of old pipes and a lot of lead pipes in the, both in homes in Flint and homes and businesses in Flint, it resulted in very high levels of lead for a lot of Flint residents, which caused all kinds of problems. And, we don't need to rehash all that, but basically what I'm getting at is, that you can't necessarily rely on states to really properly enforce this stuff, and to really protect their residents. It just does not, it does not work that well.
Even with Flint, the federal government, while there's been,
it's far from perfect, but they've generally done a better job than most states have at the state level.
We can go down the list. We've got Matt Gaetz.
He's the one that introduced the bill last week in Congress. It was HR 861.
Right, and his reasoning for it is our small businesses cannot afford to cover the costs associated with compliance, too often leading to closed doors and unemployed Americans. I suppose there is that, like, yes, compliance is difficult and high, but it's also worth doing. Because we've seen these things recover from the 50s, 60s, and 70s where they were just horribly polluted. The land has come back, and so now it's at a point where we've almost got like collective amnesia about how bad it was, and how bad many of these just.
Well, this is the United States of amnesia.
Yeah. Another rep is Barry Loudermilk. He's from Georgia. And the same kind of thing where he's, saying the Georgia would be, would do a much better job protecting the environment than a big DC bureaucracy. Again, like, I can understand the sentiment, but also I don't know how large a bureaucracy the EPA actually is comparatively, especially anytime you compare things against the largest bureaucracy, which
is the Defense Department.
Say the Defense Department. All this stuff is a pittance. Thomas Massey's from Kentucky, and it's the same kind of thing. It's just disdain for the federal agency on his voting record, according to NBC News. Those are their words, not mine. So let's just say I'm trying to be respectful. I do understand that these
frankly, having heard, many of these members of Congress speak, I don't think that they would argue. I don't think most of these guys would argue that they have a disdain for these agencies. And, we've seen, the current Congress, introduced actually a number of bills. I mean, this is one of them that's relevant to what we're talking about. But there's also there was another bill that was introduced, I think just today, to eliminate the Department of Education, and
Right. Well, and so some of this, like, I do understand the frustration, and like, I guess we're gonna delve into politics here briefly, so that's fine. There is certainly concern, even among those of us who may lean a little bit more liberal, that with the Department of Education, unions have a strong hold on that to a degree. And nobody's going to argue that there's not work to do. It's just blowing it up and making chaos. It's not necessarily the universal salve here. That may not be the best thing to do. We may want to take a more structured approach to sort of backing and unwinding those unions, because certainly unions are an issue with the Department of Education. The idea
absolutely, I totally agree. But like you said, just eliminating it, nuking the thing is not necessarily the right answer.
Yeah, I get it. I get that these are areas that are under financial and economic stress, and that it is difficult, and there is that feeling that the companies have been regulated to death. Just some of these things are sort of immediately onerous, but long term they pay off. The idea of we don't want to have a climate tax. Well, okay, but again, whose future are you mortgaging when you do that? And then we're opening up federal lands to, they want to open up federal lands to more drilling. The Dakota Access Pipeline is going to get its approval. There's a whole lot of issues around that one. You could just go back to the Dakota Wars and just be like, we're so completely wrong with that. The way we've lied to those people for so many years. I'm getting worked up.
Yeah.
But what does this mean? Is like why did it wind up, I guess, on our list of things to cover? Why, other than like these are things that we could affect the cars in positive ways in terms of making them less expensive, or rolling back some of these things that automakers are going to have to deal with. But why is it sort of something we should keep an eye on?
Mainly because I think it's almost certainly going to impact the type of cars that we have available to buy, at least in certain parts of the country, and it's going to impact the mix, the shares, the market shares of different types of vehicles over the coming decade, if some of these changes happen. So that I think affects all of us, and. It could potentially have, despite the fact that, there may be some short-term benefit to the automakers, if they basically, if they go after, if they respond too aggressively to some of the potential regulatory changes, it could end up hurting them in the long run, in terms of the global market that they still have to compete in.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this before. This is like an echo of, every generation has one of these. You can go back to the, even the earlier 2000s or the 90s or the 80s or the 70s. Like, we've seen this stuff play out before. And we know what happens. You get an economic swing, and the price of fuel now it's pretty low and it's pretty stable. But you get unrest, global unrest.
Things can change very rapidly.
Yeah,
I mean,
it changes very rapidly.
At the beginning of 2008, we had gas that was $4 a gallon, and by the end of the year, it was half of that.
It's been that way for quite a while. The gas price has been cheap, but it only takes one event. The initial gas crisis in '73 was just the result of the October War, where the United States provided support to Israel, and that got the oil-producing nations over there a little bit upset at us, and they cut supply. And now that kind of kink in supply wouldn't really dent us like it did then. And even then, it wasn't the massive restriction that it's been made out to be, but it really rattled everyone. And so that's, it just takes one thing, and we could have very expensive fuel for quite a while. Yeah. So I don't know. The idea that we're just gonna just all run to big vehicles and because gas is cheap and stuff, it makes me a little nervous. Not that I don't like big vehicles, but the swings they're difficult if you get out of sync with reality, and nobody knows what reality is going to be in the next couple of years. At any point, pick a point.
And being out of sync with reality is part of why the industry is pushing back against the fuel economy regulations as well, because the reality is we've got low fuel prices, and they're projected short of some extraordinary circumstances, their fuel prices are projected to remain low for the foreseeable future, and yet at the same time we've got these demands, regulatory demands for higher efficiency vehicles. In other parts of the world, they don't have that low fuel price scenario to deal with. And so they're able to sell those higher efficiency vehicles. And, here there's manufacturers are struggling to sell those types of vehicles because fuel is cheap. And so the consumers, say, why should I buy a more efficient vehicle, when gas is so cheap? And
that's always been the challenge with fuel efficient vehicles in the US, and small vehicles as well, just selling them profitably. The best argument I can make for that is that it's a strategic advantage to not use all of your resources in the flush times and just plan for, constrained resources. Plan for a disaster. Hope for the best and plan for the worst.
That's right.
And nobody ever does. That's sort of like, buy low, sell high. Everybody buys high and sells low. They freak out. But this sort of points
when in
up
doubt, panic, right?
Right. It's effective. Our very last topic that we have on the list is just, again, shifting market demands and some other things like emission scandals and stuff have led to the change in the type of vehicles we're even able to buy. Volkswagen has decided to walk away from small diesels and develop mild hybrids instead. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One being that they're probably easier to develop mild hybrids into more full electric vehicles should things progress that way and there be breakthroughs in battery technology, where it's very hard and very expensive to develop a diesel engine that's going to pass the emission standards, which is why Volkswagen didn't do it the last time. Right.
Yeah. I mean, as the emission standards get tougher and tougher, the cost of meeting those standards also goes up exponentially. And since VW isn't able to meet the current standards with their current diesels, meeting future standards is going to be even tougher. And so, they're looking at alternatives, and what they're, while they're putting a big emphasis on electrification and selling a lot of plug-ins and battery electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles in the next decade, that's still going to be only a vast minority of their overall sales. And where they currently sell upwards of 50-60% diesel engines, small diesel engines in their cars in Europe, they're now looking to move away from that, particularly focusing on 48 volt mild hybrids, with gasoline engines as an alternative that can, pretty much match the fuel economy of those small diesels, but potentially do it at a significantly lower cost compared to trying to meet new emission standards with those same diesel engines.
Yeah, well, and again, like just the amount of money that they'd have to sink into the diesel is astronomical. So you might as well just put that into something that's, going to be a little bit, instead of the diesel engine, which is going to have a more finite life, the battery electric stuff seems to be where things are going. So put the money there. Put the money in the future, I guess.
Yep, absolutely.
Is what I would say. So, The dream, I guess the diesel dream is dead for now.
at least, in, small diesels and small cars. Yes. I mean, I think we're still going to see diesels in larger, heavier vehicles for some time to come, just because the nature of those engines, it works very well with those type of vehicles, and, batteries, the amount of battery you need for bigger, heavier trucks, cargo vehicles and commercial vehicles, just makes them impractical. I think the going with hybrids in those smaller vehicles just makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and the diesel too, like I guess it's just a NOx thing, really, right? Like the CO2 that they output is not really that bad. And it was always the thing, sort of a good running diesel is actually cleaner than a gas engine in some respects. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly in terms of CO2 emissions, they were, much lower because CO2 is, directly proportional to the fuel that you burn. Hydrocarbon fuels that you burn, you produce carbon dioxide when you burn those. So if you burn less fuel, you produce less CO2. And that's why, they were so fond of diesels, and because they had tough CO2 standards there, and high fuel prices, with mild hybrids and smaller gasoline engines, you can now reach those same, reduced CO2 levels, at a potentially lower cost.
I just want a turbine. I go to bed sometimes dreaming about a turbine electric hybrid. Like it would burn anything you could burn.
You need to talk to Ian Wright at Wright Speed. That's what he's been developing is a turbine plug-in hybrid system for heavy duty trucks. But that's a topic maybe for next week or an upcoming show.
I have a couple of other things we should actually talk about too. I was wondering, like, okay, we see a lot of, and I'll just tee this up, but we see a lot of electric vehicle manufacturers coming in at the high end. What if you wanted to create a vehicle that sort of like sells in the 15,000 to 30,000 range? Doesn't necessarily have to be a hybrid, but like how would you sort of like, if you wanted to be an upstart auto manufacturer, I see why they're going with, it actually seems easy to do it as an electric vehicle versus, the gasoline vehicle. I just was like, I have long drives, let's say, and so I think about these things like. Well,
the challenge there is to, the cost of batteries is still sufficiently high that you're going to have a hard time getting a battery electric vehicle in that price range with a sufficient range to meet market demands.
So what if you were to just, decided you wanted to just do conventional powertrains, but come up with a car that sells, why has there not been a manufacturer that's been an upstart more conventionally, I guess? Again, this is a topic for time.
Because the cost of engineering those vehicles and tooling up to build them, the capital investment to build cars is extraordinarily high. You could conceivably buy engines from another OEM, but
you could buy them from manufacturers. They'd be willing to sell you stuff, but then I guess you kind of get a mishmash.
Yeah. Integrating all of that, into a cohesive package is problematic.
It's an interesting thought experiment, and we can continue to talk about it. So last week we actually we teed up the interviews that you did with Steve Majoros, who's Chevy's marketing manager, and Adam Heisel, who's GM's electric propulsion calibration engineer. So we can cut those in here. Did you want to have any sort of preface to that, or
no? I think we can just dive right into those. I think they're when you listen to them, they're self-explanatory. Talk to Steve about what the strategy was with the Bolt as far as why they created the type of vehicle they did, and then Adam. The conversation with Adam's a little shorter. He explains some of the technical things that they did in terms of the split between regenerative braking and friction braking on the Bolt, and some things that they did a little differently this time from what they've done previously on the Spark EV and on the Volt. Just listen to those. I think you'll find them interesting and informative, and then we'll come right back and finish it up with some reader or some listener email.
Yeah. Well, we have I guess some Twitter questions and some Facebook. Yeah. So anyway, we'll listen to those. We'll come back.
Steve, the Bolt, as I understand it, the plan is to actually market that. It's part of, you're considering that part of Chevrolet's crossover family. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
And what's the rationale for that, as opposed to marketing it as a car?
Well, I think part of it is there's a couple things. When we first started researching the vehicle, and we talked to people about what they wanted from a configuration, a vehicle standpoint, consumers give Chevrolet a lot of credibility when it comes to what I'll call high function, high utility products, right? So the Tahoe, Suburban, Equinox, Traverse, etc. And I think that by positioning this, as a crossover, now we could argue all day long about what defines a crossover, right? Does it have to have all-wheel drive, not all-wheel drive, this, that, how ride, is it a wagon, is it a hatchback, whatever. I think crossover is kind of a universally accepted term for something that has a little more ride height, has a little more functionality, traditionally a lift gate design versus a traditional trunk. And we didn't want people to take away that this was a vehicle that is more of a traditional car proportion. So we just figured it was a way to kind of get people to readily identify with the function, with the foundational configuration of the vehicle. And we get a little side benefit because Chevrolets have got a lot of traditional strength in crossovers and SUVs. So that's where we're going with it. We don't purport to say that, this is, you can, traverse great terrain in this product.
You're not going to be towing.
You're not going to be towing and what have you, and it doesn't have all-wheel drive, and so those sorts of things. So there's always convenient, arguments against it, but I think for consumers, shorthand is the right way to go with it.
Yeah, and I think especially in the last few years, there's been kind of the term crossover is kind of broadened. It's not just it's not just an SUV built on a car platform. It's become a much broader term covering a lot of different kinds of vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, look at the proliferation. You're exactly right, of just not just the number of entries, but the type of entries. And at some point, people can point at a car and say that's a car. They can point at a truck and say that's a truck. They can kind of point at traditional large utilities, Tahoe, Suburbans, Expeditions, and say that's an SUV. The rest of it, what's a Juke versus a Mazda 3 versus, a Honda, whatever that thing was, a Scion. It's this massive category of things that, I don't know necessarily what it is, but I know what it's not, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, a lot of these vehicles fall in that space, and crossover. We research a lot. If you look at consumer search behavior on the internet, and you look at things like that, we have to wind up doing a lot of work with our metadata tagging on sites and search behavior, because people do search SUV, they search crossover. So we look at that and say, there's enough kind of understanding of that term that we felt that it was a credible way to describe the car.
And I think especially if you look, especially in Europe over the last several years, there's been a lot of proliferation. And since this is a global vehicle, and I know you're mainly responsible for the U.S., but it's a global vehicle. You've got in Europe, you've got things like the Citroen Cactus and the Juke you mentioned, and there's a broad array of different types of vehicles that all kind of fall into that crossover space.
And the other part of it was customers are looking for. We like to say that this vehicle is so much more than a Monday through Friday, point A to point B, single occupant type car or vehicle, and when you place it in that kind of crossover lexicon, if we're to broaden EV adoption, and if we're going to get people, more than just what's been either available now or the customer base that's there now, people have a set of expectations that are much more than it's been historically, right? So early EV buyers, were willing to sacrifice certain things. Today's customers aren't willing to sacrifice certain things, right? I have to have a vehicle that's going to serve my utilitarian and functional needs. I want the safety features. I want infotainment. I want. And that's what we have to deliver. And so part of that is the configuration. We heard so many stories from people that were in Leafs or whatever, Sparky, our own Spark EV. I love it. But on the weekend, I got to take 2 or 3 kids to soccer and this, and we may drive 50 miles to a tournament or whatever. We may detour off and go and we never wanted to feel constricted by what the vehicle could either do or where the vehicle could take us. And so these are all very deliberate decisions on key messaging and also just kind of the configuration of the vehicle, because it really is a no compromise vehicle on what we talk about with range, et cetera, but also just basic configuration. I mean, I was fortunate to be driving, a captured test lead for about 3 months, and I've got 3, grown men and children, and they were all home for the holiday, and that was the car we took. We took it out to dinner, we went downtown, and, it was kind of like my son and I play hockey together a lot. We open the back, we're putting 2 adult hockey bags in, 4 hockey sticks going in real easy, and it's kind of like, yeah, this is kind of what it's intended to do.
How broad do you think the market is for a car like the Bolt? How aggressively is Chevrolet planning to push this in the marketplace?
Well, we've learned a lot of things from Volt, and I think in the subsequent generations of Volt. I think that what you will see from us the kinds of things you would expect to see from us. Where we need to be, experiential is key. Getting people to get behind the wheel of the car and see it. We like to say, pictures don't do this car justice, and I'd rather have 100 people get behind the wheel, experience it, and drive it if they can, versus just a banner hung somewhere that says, "Hey, Bolt EV is a great car," right? Mm-hmm. So we're doing a lot of experiential things. We're doing a lot of things with the thing about EV people, diesel people, performance people. Smaller universe, but boy, high content needs, high social chatter. So we have to be present in the places where we can help people with content and help people understand what this vehicle does. But we're going to put this into some of our broader communications, and you'll see this tomorrow morning. We have a new execution in our shattering perceptions campaign, as we call it, or the real people, not actors, where Bolt EV plays a prominent role because again, early on, EVs had to be different in some reason, and kind of the marketing had to be different. Now EVs are just like, hey, I don't want to look like I'm driving some strange vehicle. It's got to meet all these needs I've got, including a sense of design aesthetic. Same thing from the marketing. So we didn't want to say, well, let's have Chevrolet be this in marketing, but you know what? Cut Volt from the herd and do something over here. Bolt EV is going to play a natural part of our story because I think it's important for 2 things. Number one, the gravitas of Chevrolet can help buoy Bolt EV. And I think Bolt EV adds a dimension to the Chevrolet brand that a lot of people may not either know of or think about. We're great at crossovers and sport utilities, right? We're great in trucks. We're great in performance. Our car portfolio is doing great things with the new models out there. But a lot of, out here, people know the electric space great. Most states, they don't. Uh-huh. But if they can see that Chevrolet is a progressive, forward-thinking brand, we talk about putting emphasis and proof points behind Find New Roads. Well, there's no better proof point of that than this vehicle right here. So it will be unique things to the EV space in the marketing, but it will be part of our broader efforts because I think that, again, that two-way street will work nicely, that Bolt EV can benefit Chevrolet and Chevrolet can benefit Bolt EV.
You mentioned experiential before. I think GM or Chevrolet has talked about having Bolts as part of the Lyft Express Drive program, and also putting them into Maven fleets. Is that going to be? Do you see that as being a significant part of that experiential play of getting people exposed to this vehicle?
Yeah, I mean that's going to be part of it. I mean, there's probably 4 or 5 major levers that we're working on. Obviously, we're very fortunate to have that relationship, to have developed the Maven brand within the company and the relationship with Lyft. So we're working through the details now about how Bolt EVs play a role there, but that's certainly one part of it. We have a phenomenal program that you don't hear much about unless you're at the auto show. Now, we were probably right at NAIS together. We don't do it in Detroit just by virtue of weather and timing. Right. But in most markets, we have an auto show test drive program. So people can, we will either, so if you were a hand raiser for Bolt EV, you said, hey, keep me up to speed here. We'll invite you to the auto show. We'll give you first preference to come and drive the vehicle. So come to the auto show, check it out, and then there's closed course or open course to drive the vehicle. Did it in Portland, did it in San Francisco, did it in San Diego, and a lot of other markets. So that's one way where we can, again, get those people that are interested. Or you just happen to be wandering on the show, you talk to someone on the show floor, and they say, hey, you want to drive it? It's right outside. And Bolt EV, I mean, this is a great stat. It's blowing away Camaro on test drives. And you'd think that most people, right, when I say, I got a chance to drive the new Camaro, the Bolt EV test drive, the line is considerably longer to get inside Bolt EV. So we're doing programs like that. We're doing innovative programs. We've got one called Test Drive My Way, which is a kind of a test program we're doing in a couple markets. We started with Volt, and it did great things for us, where we'll actually bring the vehicle to your home. We'll give you 24 hours with the car. We have a trained sales consultant that can help you walk through the vehicle, but it kind of lets you experience the vehicle on your time, on your terms. You can park it in your garage, those sorts of things. So again, a limited small market program, but we're seeing some great success with it. So how do we replicate and get scale with that? And then other things we're doing, right? So other exposure opportunities, but driving and being in the car is a big part of what we're going to do.
Okay. And I assume you probably don't want to talk about, kind of what your target volumes are for, but in terms of volume, is it going to come down to meeting whatever the customer, the market demand is, or do you plan to at least initially limit the volumes for whatever other business reasons?
Well, we're gonna go hard after what customer demand is, and the trick is you don't really know what customer demand is. I mean, this is such a new and interesting space. It's one side is this could take off and be phenomenal, and that'd be great for us. One side is, in many ways it's like NIMBY in prisons, right? I mean, everyone's for them, just not in my backyard. I think one of the things that we face with electric vehicles is when you have the rational discussion with, X number of people, everyone's like, of course, I'm in. And what we hear sometimes is, that's great for him, right? And so we have to kind of, what we're working very hard on now, and our dealers are working very hard on, is how do we translate attention and acceptance to transaction? We got a pretty good sense of where first year volume is going to be. And remember, a lot of this was planned out, 3-4 years ago. Sure. I mean, if we wanted to, if we were on, pick a car, whatever, Cruise or Camaro or whatever, and we were
a lot better idea of what to expect.
And we got a lot, I would say, probably a little more supplier nimbleness, where we've got things and we say, hey man, whatever, feature X is running real hot. Can we get 10% more? Mm-hmm. Blah. And you could, make things happen.
It's a little harder when you're talking about batteries, supplies, and motors.
Yeah, batteries and drive units and then what have you. So we got a pretty good sense of where we think year one volume is going to be. And we're looking really at Bolt EV kind of in combination with Volt, right? Mm-hmm. Because again, we don't have 50 years of cross-shopping migration behavior to say, well, we really have kind of a sense of where these will go, and really, we think year one, we don't think Volt's gonna miss a beat. Mm-hmm. I mean, Volt had its best year ever last year, best December, best month ever. So Volt is still going hot. We think Bolt EV is going to come in and run hot. I think the trick for us is really going to be year 2, year 3. As we say, okay, that was year 1. Kind of, I'm sure we're going to meet what we have internally forecasted. We'll get a sense of where market demand is, and then we'll dial up or dial down.
When you saw nearly 400,000 people sign up to pre-order a Tesla Model 3 last spring, did that cause you to rethink any of this? As far as your projections of volume?
Well, I think what it says is there's a lot of people interested in the space, and we like to say that EV attention. It's the old high tide raises all boats. We love what Tesla has done for the market, just like I'm sure they look at us and they love what Bolt EV has done for the market. Because if we can get EV into the conversation and consideration set, if we can get more people understanding what it's truly like to live electric and drive electric, I think the better off it's going to be for everybody. I mean, if God knows what the mobility will be like 50 years from now, right? But if you could say that there were a few companies that really were really part of the catalyst for the change, and if GM and Chevrolet was one of those, I think that's going to be a good thing for us. The trick for that is, and nobody has the Tesla crystal ball, how many of those are curiosity seekers? How many of those are just, well, sure, why not? How many of those are, I'm dead set, I'm going to get one? And there's certainly those people, there's no doubt. it's a little bit like an election, right? It's, California, the Republicans will never swing that in their favor, and whatever, the Democrats will never swing state X in their favor. But there's a lot of people kind of in the middle. If we can tell our product story, if we can get people believing that Chevrolet is a credible electric manufacturer, if they can trust who we are as a company, they have access to the product and a great dealer network, and we deliver on the promises that we made, which we have, then I think we're going to go out there in year one and make some noise.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Okay, man.
Adam Heisel.
And what's your title?
So I'm the lead propulsion calibrator on the Chevrolet Bolt EV.
All right. So obviously with EVs, compared to internal combustion engine cars, software plays a much bigger role. Although it's playing a big role on everything now, but especially on electric vehicles. What were some of the overall challenges, and what were some of the solutions that you guys came up with that's unique to this car that you, based on things you've learned previously from the Volt and the Spark EV and so on?
Yeah, so with this car, I mean, the biggest thing when we started doing the testing was we had to get 200 miles. Like, we knew that was this magic threshold. All of our research has shown 200 miles was going to open the car up to people that previously said, it's just too short of a range, they wouldn't have to deal with it. 200 miles, like this new category. So that was like first and foremost in everything. So then you start pecking away at what can we do to be more efficient with everything. The regenerative braking that we have in the vehicle, there's a couple different combinations of it, whether it's in drive, with shifters in drive, and you push the brake pedal. We have some additive brake region that we put in there, so you push the brakes, you get some motor torque that you get, and then also the friction brakes will kick in if you push the brakes hard enough. And then beyond that, through the Volt previously, in Gen 1 Volt, so when it first launched, it had a drive and a low mode in the shifter. And the low is if you want to try to maybe slow the car down a little bit more, people would pull in the low. We started finding out pretty quickly that our customers, we have several customers that would drive around the low all the time. I don't think it was ever envisioned that mode. It was just kind of this auxiliary mode we put. And so if you're talking to them and seeing what we did on Gen 2 Volt, where they then added the region on demand paddle, we're taking it to the next levels, like, turning it up to 11, if you will, of giving them even more authority in the pedal. So now you can, as opposed to having to dance over to the brake pedal while you're slowing down, you just start lifting off the accelerator pedal, and it gives you that deceleration. If you want it all the way, you fully left off, and if not, you have to keep it applied just a touch in there.
And one of the things that you mentioned earlier was traditionally with hybrids and earlier EVs, as you come down to almost to a stop, the regen is generally phased up, and you phase in your friction braking to finish the stop. Yeah. And you mentioned you're doing something different now with the Bolt.
Yeah, I like to say, since, General Motors, I think 1948, we came up with the automatic transmission with the Buick, and we got creep torque as a byproduct of that. I don't know if it was ever the intent that we needed to have this mode. If you had to explain to somebody how to drive a car, it's at low speed, you got to modulate the brake pedal to putz around the parking lot, and then somewhere around 5 miles per hour, you start using the other pedal. If we could redesign it, like, why would you do that? We've been emulating that for a while in our electric vehicles, in the Volt and the Spark EV. So here, when you shift it into low, now the car does not have that creep torque. It figures out what torque it needs to hold whatever kind of hill you're on. If you're on a slight uphill, it figures out you need some positive torque to hold it, or a slight downhill, some negative torque to hold you in that position. So then as you drive it, you get regen torque when you initially lift off it at the pedal at speed, and it's negative torque the entire way until you get to a stop, and then we have to do that little decision of what does the torque need to be, and we're trying to bring the vehicle to a stop. If you're in drive, it's a little bit different, because in drive, we're trying to offer the customer a very familiar type of situation. So we do have the creep torque in drive. And in that case, we do the transition like we've traditionally done, where it's negative torque, and then we have to start putting the friction brakes on to hold the vehicle, to kind of hold the vehicle back from the torque that would be applied in that condition. So we kind of do a combination of both, but low is all new. When you pull the paddle behind the steering wheel, or if the shifter's in low and you're not pushing the brake pedal, the brakes are not applied, the friction brakes are not applied. It's all done with torque in the motor, which allows us to then capture that energy and put it back into the battery every time you slow down.
So you've got four main modes.
That's right.
Can you just give me a quick run through of all?
Yeah, so we drive and low in the shifter positions, but then behind the steering wheel we have the region on demand paddle. So the combination of those is kind of 2 times 2. That's your 4 different modes. Drive is intended to be a mode that is similar to a gasoline engine vehicle. You lift off, and typically gasoline engine vehicle, you've got the aerodynamic losses and some engine braking that occurs. And so that's somewhere around 0.07 to 0.1 type of G level, depending what speed you do it out. But but that's a little bit of deceleration. And then from there, you can shift it to low, and that's going to bring you down to maybe around 0.2G to 0.25G, somewhere in that threshold, which is pretty similar to some of the other vehicles that are out there, maybe the BMW i3, like we mentioned. And then in either drive or low, if you pull that paddle, you get even more. If you're in low and you pull the paddle, you go all the way to 0.3 Gs of pure deceleration, all with motor torque that's going to be charging the battery. Drive is slightly less than that, but it's probably around 0.25 Gs is what it is in drive when you pull the paddle, so it's pretty close. It's pretty aggressive. The biggest step is if you're in drive and you pull the paddle, it's a pretty dramatic step in your deceleration. But if it's too much, you just tip the accelerator pedal a little bit to find whatever medium ground that you want.
So the nice thing about it, I haven't been out in the Volt yet, but certainly in the i3, for urban driving, being able to do that single pedal mode when you're in stop and go traffic is great. It's great.
It may not be for everybody. As I said on the i3, you better like it because that's your only option on the i3. Right. Here, we're giving the customer, if you like it, use it. If not, then you can adjust a little bit. And again, the paddle's another option. I said the Volt customers, we learned that a lot of them are using low, but I still think that a lot of people are never going to shift it to low, even how much we try to inform the journalists and inform the dealers. There's some people who have been told in other cars not to use low, whether it's Honda or something like that, that's probably their background. So that's the region on demand paddle, which is clear in its naming convention, region on demand, that's another option that they can use. If you pull that paddle, it'll also bring the car to a complete stop. That's another thing that's different from the Volt there that we've heard on the Volt, and the LR customer said, I pull this paddle and it'll slow me down, but then again at some speed I still got to transition my foot over to the brake pedal. And so this is kind of those learned lessons that, let's just bring it all to a complete stop. And then once you're at a stop, you can release the paddle so you don't have to hold the paddle as you're at a stop sign or stoplight the entire time.
So you have like a brake hold scenario.
Well, again, we're doing with motor torque. If you haven't pushed the brakes are not on in this car. Right. But if you go to a steep hill and you push the brakes and you release the brake, we have hill start assist that will trap that brake pressure. So that can really help hold you all the way to a 20-30% grade. When the grades get real steep, we don't want to be sitting there holding that with motor torque. It's far more efficient to be able to stop on a steep hill with the brake.
Sure.
Infinite clamping pressure almost there, right? So it's a better way to do it.
Yeah, because otherwise, if you're using the motor, you're using up energy from the battery.
Using up energy, you're generating heat into it. If you sit on the hill long enough, it's not things we want to have happen on the motor.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Fantastic.
And we're back. The magic of editing.
Yes, we do have a Twitter question and a Facebook question. Twitter question from Surtur or however he wants to pronounce his name.
A guy we
or
I
her.
don't necessarily see eye to eye on the political tweetage, but thank you for the question.
Okay. At any rate, this listener posed the question: can you take an electric car to a track day, and how many laps could it be run before it needs to be recharged?
Formula E.
Strictly speaking, yes, you could take it to a track day. But as with any other type of car, regardless of the propulsion system, it's a complicated question. It depends on the specifics of the design of that vehicle. What type of cooling it's got. Like, for example, the original Tesla Roadster was absolutely not recommended for track use because the design of the motor in that car would tend to heat up very quickly from hard driving of the type you would do on a track. So it would not do very well. And in fact, while that Tesla has improved the cooling of their motors somewhat, a Model S today still would not do very well on the track, as the guys from Car and Driver demonstrated last year. They have a long-term Model S that they had for a year. And in 2015, when they did their lightning lap competition at Virginia International Raceway, they took the Model S down to VIR as a support vehicle, but they did not bother to run it as part of the competition, even though the Model S and the Model X now are extraordinarily quick, accelerating from a standing start. They are actually rather poor track vehicles. In part because of their weight. They're very large and heavy cars, but also despite their weight, compared to other cars of similar size, when run hard in a sustained manner like you would on a track, both the battery and the motors and the power electronics heat up pretty quickly, and you lose a lot of efficiency and a lot of power. And what we can do is in the show notes, I'll include a link to the story that they published last year with the video showing how poorly the Model S did on the track. So that's one example. If you had an electric vehicle, electric powertrain that was designed for that kind of use, to have better heat dissipation, then you certainly could conceivably run it on the track. As to how many laps you could run before it needs to be recharged, just as with a gas powered race car, it depends how big the fuel tank is, and how hard you run it. Certainly the harder you run it, the more energy you're going to draw out of the battery a lot faster, and it's just not going to go as far.
Yeah, well, and like the Formula E cars, I think they bring 2 cars to the races because it's not just like stop to recharge. It's that thermal management is really important too. So you can't just pump all that power back in. It's not liquid. You gotta let the batteries cool. You gotta let the motors cool. So they swap cars. Yeah, in the middle of the race.
Yeah, I think the races are 60 minutes, and they run, or maybe even a little bit less than that, and they run 30 minutes with one car, and rather than doing a recharge, the driver pulls in to the garage, hops out of one car and hops into another identical car that's fully charged, and finishes the last 30 minutes of the race with that one.
But I do think that racing with the electric powertrains is going to actually bring us to a breakthrough of some sort with battery technology and just making things more efficient and durable, and it's good. It's another.
Oh yeah, it'll absolutely help.
We got a lot out of the internal combustion engine through racing, and we're still getting benefits from it. It's just we've picked all the low hanging fruit. So
yeah, so the reality is most EVs today are not at all optimized for track type use. In theory, you could take any car to a track, but it just, it's not going to be, you're not going to have a very good experience with most current EVs on the track.
So is that also why we see all these new EVs? They brag about their super scorching fast 0 to 60 or quarter mile times.
Right. And you never see Nürburgring lap times with those cars.
Because I got to say, I'm so sick of those times too.
Yeah, well, the reality is, once you're under 3 seconds from 0 to 60, almost no one is going to be able to tell from the seat of the pants the difference between 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, or 2.4 or 2.389. It's meaningless, and
really, really fast.
And a publication that I'm not going to name today, did yet another clickbait article that, allowed Elon Musk to go tweeting again about how fast the Model S is, at this point, it's an utterly meaningless number. It's not something that you can, realistically or safely use in the real world. Anything under about 5 seconds, that's about all, about as much as you need, for merging onto a freeway. It's fun to have, but it's one isolated data point. Frankly, I'd personally, I don't go drag racing all the time. I'd rather have a car that can get through curves quickly, which is something that, 4,700 pound Model S, does not do so well. So I'd rather have something smaller and lighter, like the Bolt.
Yeah, well, we just totally sound like the 2 old guys on the Muppet Show. So,
yeah.
I did get one other Twitter question, which is just mid-engine Corvette ? It's like, I guess probably. I don't know. That's another thing I've been hearing. Since
if you ask Don Sherman from Car and Driver, he will absolutely
convinced.
He's been convinced of it for the last 25 years. So
I was gonna say he's been convinced of it since the 70s.
Yeah, probably.
Sure. I mean. Is that even a good idea? I know that they've extracted about as much performance as they possibly can from the front engine rear wheel drive layout. But again, that's another, performance isn't.
Yeah. The front engine rear drive Corvette, is a fantastic car. For street use, you're going to be hard pressed to beat it. However, given that Chevrolet, spends a lot of money on racing at Le Mans and in the IMSA WeatherTech series, I think that they have a fierce rivalry with Ford. Ford has committed to spending at least 3 more seasons racing the GTs. And so I would not be surprised if, just as, Porsche this year has introduced a mid-engine 911 RSR for racing, that I wouldn't be surprised if at come June at Le Mans, during the festivities in the run up to the race, that Chevrolet takes the wraps off of a new mid-engine Corvette that will be built in very low volumes, just like the GT, and be created primarily to homologate it for racing in GTLM at Le Mans and or GTLM in IMSA and GTE Pro at Le Mans.
So possibly.
Well, I mean, we've seen spy photos now, in the last week or two of, what certainly appears to be a mid-engine Corvette, running alongside some front engine, C7s, that are probably a new ZR1, during winter testing up in northern Michigan. So it's I guess, at this point, I would be surprised if they don't make one, but just don't expect it to be the mainstream Corvette. It will probably be, like I said, very low volume, maybe a few hundred units a year, just like the GT, mainly built to homologate it for racing.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty safe bet. They can swing that kind of thing. So maybe we'll all get that mid-engine Corvette. I really wish it would be the thing like the mid-engine rotary engine thing.
The four-rotor, 1973 four-rotor.
Right? What is that, CERV3 or whatever?
No, that was not one of the CERV concepts. It was originally called the four-rotor, and then later, about 1974, 75, they pulled the four-rotor engine, the Wankel engine, out of it and put in a small block. And it was renamed the Aerovet.
Oh, and Bill Mitchell hated that thing.
Yeah. And that one actually had the original Falcon wing doors. Everybody talks about Tesla inventing the Falcon wing doors, the gull wing doors with a hinge in the middle of it. But in fact, if you go back and look up the Aerovet, and I'll look for a link to photos of it, it had the same style of gull wing doors that were hinged in the middle, so they don't stick out as far. On that car.
Huh. I mean, there was Bricklin and DeLorean too that had. They had the fixed gull wings, So the doors were one piece. They weren't hinged in the middle. Oh, that's right. The little flappy. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can talk about that forever. So let's move on to our Facebook question. What 2 car brands would you like to merge to make a better super brand? Anthony asks, and he says his choice is, and why? His choice is Lincoln and Mazda because Mazda doesn't really have a luxury division and Lincoln is too close to Ford's Platinum products. I think you will find that you will never divorce Lincoln from Ford because Lincoln is Ford.
And Mazda was only very recently divorced from Ford, so
yeah. So that's interesting. I don't see that one happening.
No.
Maybe Mazda and Mitsubishi.
Well, Mitsubishi's under Nissan.
That's true. They got
Renault Nissan control now.
Mazda and Chrysler. Those two. Because
I don't know that. I mean, I love Mazda. But I'm not sure that, the old line, I don't want to call them a turkey, but, the old line about, mating 2 turkeys doesn't make an eagle.
No, but I'm just FCA has been very clear about wanting to merge with a small car partner.
Well,
to the point where they've killed.
Well, no, what they want is they want somebody to produce small cars for them. They don't want to necessarily merge with a company like Mazda. That is a small company.
So they basically want
they want somebody with big pockets to take them over.
Oh, they want
that's why they tried so hard to merge with GM.
Yeah. Oh, and there's just way too much redundancy with them with GM.
Yeah.
Yeah, GM would be selling against itself even with Jeep and GMC. So there's no way.
Right.
That.
I mean, there was some rumor last year, about FCA potentially being taken over by Samsung. Who knows what's going to happen with FCA. Mazda, I think in the long term probably will not remain independent. I suspect they will get absorbed by somebody, and my guess is that it might well be a Chinese manufacturer that takes them over.
Well, that's what I was just going to say about FCA.
What might be an interesting combination is if Geely took over Mazda. So you've got Geely also owns Volvo.
Right.
So you've got Volvo as kind of that premium brand, and then Mazda, as a slightly premium mainstream brand.
Well, and the two are not strangers either, because under Ford they were together.
That's true. Yeah,
the Mazda 3 and the
getting the band back together.
Yeah. There you go. Then they just need to buy out Ford, and they. This is a game we could play for a while.
But actually, that might not be a bad combination. If Geely took over Mazda, because that would give them an entry into other markets outside of China. With a known brand, and they have the pockets to the deep pockets to support Mazda and keep them going. And you could have some technology sharing. I mean, there's some potentially very good technology sharing in terms of powertrains and so on between Mazda and Volvo and Geely. So I think that's an interesting one. I'll have to think about that and maybe write something longer about that.
Well, and not even necessarily just Geely too. Like there's plenty of other.
Oh yeah, there's lots of Chinese domestic brands that would love to get a foothold in the West. With a known brand.
Trying, right? Like there's BYD, there's Brilliance, there's SAIC, and like these are names that we've heard. They're not here yet to any degree. And they may not be, but the Chinese auto market is giant. It's like this giant shadow.
It's way bigger than any other market now. I mean, I think they're on target for 28 million sales this year. Which is
that's 10 million more than us.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could see it. And they have some cool stuff over there too. Like so what happens too is like a lot of these I'll call them Western automakers, right? They sell their older stuff into the Chinese market because it's been a burgeoning market for a while. So older generation Volkswagens, like the original Passat, the Santana.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's still built over there, but it was built over there for quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean they do still. I mean I don't think they sell that one anymore, but they do still. Many of the Western brands do still sell some older generation models in the Chinese market, at the low end, as entry level models. But they also sell their latest and greatest stuff, and in fact, in a lot of cases they have stuff. They have variations that are exclusive to the Chinese market, particularly the long wheelbase models, because there's a significant demand for vehicles with extra rear seat legroom, for people that don't want to drive but want to be driven. So you'll find things like long wheelbase versions of BMW 3 Series and 5 Series and Mercedes E-Class and even the C-Class that are sold nowhere else but in China.
Yeah. So at a certain point, we'll see some kind of Chinese deals happening. That'll be very interesting. I think that's probably a good idea. Maybe.
Well, there's actually, I was actually at an Automotive Press Association luncheon in Detroit last week, where Mike Dunn was there speaking. He recently wrote a book about the Chinese market, published a book, and he spent quite a long time living in China, and he's quite familiar with the market over there. And he was talking about the fact that, while we don't see Chinese brands as such being sold over here, we actually, the Chinese have actually invested in a lot of suppliers. So a lot of the supplier base are now owned by Chinese companies. Companies like Nexteer, which was a spinoff of Delphi, which was a spinoff of GM. Nexteer was the former GM's former Saginaw steering division. And it was last year, it was purchased by a Chinese company, A123 batteries. And of course, the remnants of Fisker were bought by Wangxiang, another Chinese supplier. Saab, yeah.
Right.
And of course, the Buick Envision, is produced in China, and was the first mainstream model exported to North America from China for sale. It's produced by GM and SAIC in China.
Yeah. At a certain point, we're probably all gonna be considering this new brand on the market over here that's Chinese.
Yeah, it's bound to happen sooner or later. It's a question of when, not if.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, somebody just puts imposes some crazy tariffs on everything imported. But can't imagine that happening.
Well, I mean, you remember what we were talking about with things being expensive, and the price of everything, like in a global market. This could be a lot of interesting domino effects for us to talk about. I don't want to get into it all right now.
Yeah, need something for next week.
But So speaking of next week, let's call it a night, and we'll take off. Let you get to the Chicago show. That you're there until the end of the week, and then we'll recap it next week.
Absolutely, sounds good.
All right, thanks.
All right, see you next week, everybody.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Ranked #1 in innovation for 10 consecutive years and #2 among public universities for employability, ASU isn't just ahead of the curve, it's creating new paths to success. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online, that's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Owning a boat comes with a number of perks, like being able to fling your favorite fishing rod around. And here's another perk. Geico's boat insurance covers your boat and your belongings. And with specialist support from agents that are as passionate about boating as you are, there's so much value that you'll want to high-five someone. But not while you're holding your fishing rod. That's a prized possession. So hold on tight with both hands and keep it covered through boat insurance. Get more with Geico.